Today, younger collectors don't remember a time when Star Wars action figures were not on the shelves. For the last 30 years, there has been a constant and regular release of figures based on characters from the Star Wars universe. You'd be hard-pressed to find an action figure toy aisle that doesn't have some Star Wars product, be it Micro Galaxy Squadron, Vintage Collection, Black Series, or even the current Hasbro 5POA kid-friendly line Epic Heroes. Star Wars as a toy brand has become so ubiquitous and continuous that there are frequent collector discussions about Star Wars toy fatigue. But it wasn't always that way. I've discussed in other Star Wars toy history videos on this channel how Kenner was not ready with action figures in 1977 when Star Wars first hit, and how they scrambled to get product on shelves. The first figures hit in 1978, and for years Star Wars ruled the toy aisle during the original run of the original trilogy films. Then came the dark times. By 1985, the original Star Wars toy line, launched by Kenner in 1977, was winding to a close. With Return of the Jedi fading from the cultural zeitgeist and kids moving on to other interests, sales were down. However, Kenner did see a future. It was called The Epic Continues and would feature original characters, a new storyline, and would be peppered with various vehicles from the original trilogy, as well as main character refreshes and a few original trilogy characters who had not made the original cut. The 1985 product line, dubbed Power of the Force, showed the slowly emerging framework for this, with a Stormtrooper Luke thrown in as well as a very deep cut, like the Imperial dignitary, who could have easily tied into the Epic Continues storyline that Kenner had crafted. One where the remains of the Imperial forces struggle against a rebellion, transforming into a new republic. In Power of the Force, more mini-rigs of Kenner design were added to the line, and Kenner had even outlined a way to bring Grand Moff Tarkin back. Somehow, Tarkin has returned, and they had plans to add Tarkin to the Epic Continues 1986 product line. However, Lucasfilm was unimpressed and wanted to rest the main Star Wars toy line and invest in spin-offs, Droids, and Ewoks. Both of these had Saturday morning cartoons, and there were two highly rated live-action Ewok movies, whether the public wanted them or not. The Droids and Ewok toy lines, both focused on the cartoon versions of these characters, ended up with many unproduced figures and without setting the world on fire as the original Kenner line had. In toy aisles and cartoon lineups dominated by He-Man, Transforming Robots, Real American Heroes, Mask, Princesses of Power, and the 80s pastels of the Care Bears, what chance did a fussy droid and his walking trash can friend, or furry murder bears that were cutesied up a little, actually have? It was in this era that Marvel's Star Wars comic book, which originally launched in 1977, was also ended after over 100 issues. Attempts at Droid and Ewok comic books through Marvel's Star Comics imprint, which leaned heavily into licensed properties with a more kid-oriented slant, were as unsuccessful as the cartoons they drew from had been. Both were cancelled with less than 12 produced issues. The public's appetite for Star Wars had cooled considerably. It was a dark time for the rebellion. However, things were not dark for long. Almost as soon as it died, Star Wars began to rise again, and the Force would reawaken. In 1987, West End Games would release the first edition of the Star Wars role-playing game. It was an officially licensed product and began the process of fully fleshing out George Lucas's world in a way that the movies, novelizations, and the handful of expanded universe books that were released between 1977 to 1984 had not. If you've ever wondered why Walrus Man is Ponda Baba or Hammerhead is Moma Nadon, you have 1989's Galaxy Guide 1, A New Hope from West End Games to thank. West End Games produced updates and expansions regularly through the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1988, Blackthorn Publishing would release 3 issues of Star Wars 3D, set directly after the events of A New Hope. Blackthorn Publishing released a robust line of 3D comics featuring other popular licensed properties, including G.I. Joe, Real American Hero, Transformers, Rambo, California Raisins, Brave Star, and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. It was during this stretch of time that Bantam Books editor Lou Aronia would propose a new trilogy of books to Lucasfilm that would begin publication in 1991. The new trilogy, written by Timothy Zahn, had a few caveats, with the major one being that it had to be set 3 to 5 years after Return of the Jedi, and that no characters killed in the films could return. This seems to explicitly be in reference to Darth Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Yoda, as the character of the cloned Jedi Master was originally intended to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. Zahn was supplied with supplementary content from West End Games to flesh out and build the post-Return of the Jedi world of Star Wars. The book would hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The trilogy ended in 1993 and sold a combined total of 15 million copies. The success of Timothy Zahn's trilogy proved that there was more than just niche interest in Star Wars, and launched an entire series of books that would begin to build out the Star Wars expanded universe and help set the stage for Star Wars once again becoming a global phenomenon. Timothy Zahn brought several pieces of Star Wars lore to the table that remain to this day, surviving the eventual reboot by Disney that relegated all expanded universe content prior to April 25th, 2014 as Legends. Among Zahn's significant additions to the Star Wars universe was the name Coruscant, for the world previously referred to by Lucasfilm as Imperial Center, and the introduction of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Coruscant was adapted officially by Lucasfilm during the Special Edition era and would be officially named on screen in Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace. Grand Admiral Thrawn would be reintroduced in the Star Wars Expanded Universe post-Disney, starting with Star Wars Rebels in 2016. Also launching in 1991 was Star Wars Dark Empire by Tom Veitch and Cam Kennedy. This comic series, released via Dark Horse Comics, would also become a driving force in the return of Star Wars and introduce the concept of Emperor Palpatine returning via the use of clone bodies. Somehow, Palpatine returned, despite Lucasfilm wanting no dead characters to return. Released initially as a 6-issue bi-monthly series from December 1991 to October 1992, the moody art and dark storyline would launch an entire line of Star Wars comics at Dark Horse, and would spawn 2 less regarded sequels. Production on Dark Empire had started on November 9, 1988, when writer Tom Veitch sent a letter proposing the series to George Lucas. On November 22, 1988, Lucas licensing head Lucy Altry Wilson called Veitch, and the process began. Veitch's original proposal was to set the series between the prequels, which were then still in the earliest stages of development, and the original trilogy, and focus on Vader hunting down and destroying the Jedi. However, due to concerns about the proposed story interfering with the forthcoming prequels, the time period was moved to post-Jedi. Originally, the plan was for the series to be produced at Marvel, but in a series of events that created delays involving creative differences between Timothy Zahn and Veitch and shifting editorial staff at Marvel, the project would eventually land at Dark Horse Comics. The series was an enormous success, with the public eager for more Star Wars content. In 1992, the Sci-Fi Channel launched by airing the Star Wars movies with hosting segments by Carrie Fisher. In 1995, Billy D. Williams would host to promote the original trilogy release of the box set, with that year's marathon airing the movies in letterbox format. Sci-Fi, USA Network, TBS Network, and eventually Spike TV would continue to air the marathons of the original trilogy throughout the 1990s and even into the early 2000s, several times airing them around the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday when families stuck at home with each other needed to escape to a galaxy far, far away. 1992 also saw the release of Super Star Wars for the Super Nintendo gaming system. Quickly becoming a bestseller, it was key in introducing Star Wars to a new demographic of kids who weren't quite old enough to remember the original movies. It was mostly a side-scroll game, but there were levels where you could pilot land speeders and X-Wings. It was followed by Super Empire Strikes Back in 1992 and Super Return of the Jedi in 1994. All three games were highly regarded and big sellers at the time, and are still highly rated to this day. In 2009, the official Nintendo magazine placed Super Star Wars as 68th on a list of the greatest Nintendo games of all time. In 1993, the release of the X-Wing and Rebel Assault games would bring the franchise to PC and CD-ROM gaming. In the early 1990s, computers were becoming more common in homes, with them becoming more accessible financially and more user-friendly to the average layperson without much technical know-how. Like with the Super Nintendo games, they sold well and were important pieces in returning Star Wars to the forefront of the cultural zeitgeist. Starting in 1993, Bendems would begin releasing Star Wars figures. They were, and still are, widely considered to be terrible, but for 2 years they were Star Wars figures on shelves, and they sold well enough that several waves were released with a variety of single-carded figures, gift sets, and even a reuse of the Kenner Darth Vader case mold. There were 21 figures in all. Collect them all, if you hate yourself. However, these did sell well enough that they helped prove there was again a market for Star Wars toys. Also in 1993, the Star Wars trilogy The Definitive Collection was released on Laserdisc. This featured various formats and included extra features, a 16-page booklet about the production side of things, and a hardcover book, George Lucas, The Creative Impulse. It was quite popular and quickly sold out, demanding high prices on the secondary market. In 1994, Galoob would begin to release Micro Machine sets of Star Wars. These would prove popular and by the line's end would expand to include playsets, figures, and an entire spin-off line called Action Fleet, which would feature slightly larger vehicles and playsets. They were really cool. These were incredibly successful, building on the return to public consciousness of Star Wars in the toy aisle. And they were way cooler than the Bendems. The success of Galoob Star Wars toys and those horrible Bendems showed that there was definitely a strong market for Star Wars toys in the 1990s, priming things for Kenner to make a big dramatic return. However, that didn't happen in 1994. In 1994, Kenner began releasing die-cast metal figures in their Action Masters line. This line featured characters drawn from several properties licensed to Kenner at the time. Among them were Aliens, Predator, Terminator, Batman the Animated Series, Legends of Batman, Superman, and Star Wars. There were single-carded releases of R2-D2, C-3PO, Darth Vader, Bespin Luke, and a Stormtrooper. There was a 4-pack card release with R2-D2 and C-3PO, plus new figures Leia and Obi-Wan, neither of whom were available in any other form. There was also a 6-pack box set release with Bespin Luke, Vader, the Stormtrooper, plus new figures Han, Chewbacca, and Boba Fett. These three were not available anywhere else, although there had been rumors that Chewbacca and Boba Fett had been planned for individual release. Action Masters was not much of a hit on the toy aisle, and it did not last longer than a year. Although the Star Wars molds would be revisited a year later, but more on that when we get to 1995. In 1995, there was a significant marketing push from Lucasfilm as the original trilogy was released with new artwork on Laserdisc and VHS on June 16, 1995. It was advertised as the last time the original versions of each movie would be available in their original forms. This was not entirely accurate though, as the films had been digitally remastered in THX sound, and the version of Star Wars released featured the Episode 4 A New Hope opening crawl, which was not added to negatives of the film until its April 10, 1981 re-release. These were not actually the original theatrical versions, but altered versions. George Lucas just can't be stopped. By 1995, Kenner Toys was no longer its own company. They had been bought by Tonka in 1987. And in 1991, Hasbro purchased Tonka. The boys' action figure lines at Hasbro were all sent to the Kenner division, and Kenner mostly continued as before with their iconic logo and the type of action figures for movies and licensed properties consumers had come to expect from them, over their evolution from the $6 Man in 1975 to Star Wars to Superpowers to Ghostbusters, and finally to all things Batman with a weird sidestep to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. A stipulation of the original Star Wars licensing contract with Kenner was a requirement to pay an annual royalty of $10,000 to retain the rights. Hasbro forgot to do this. To regain the rights, Hasbro had to pay much more of a royalty per figure toy than Kenner had for the vintage line. This was at least part of what had Kenner Hasbro rushing to get product out, and a lot of product. They needed big sales to justify the money they had to spend. And a big part of that justification was they were wanting to lock in the rights to Star Wars Episode 1 toys, which was then known by the working title Balance of the Force, as well as toys for the multimedia event planned for 1996, Shadows of the Empire. Episode 1 was expected to be lucrative, and Hasbro obviously wanted a piece of that pie. Kenner Hasbro locked in the rights with Lucasfilm for Star Wars toys through 1998, with them looking to prove themselves in hopes they could win the Episode 1 toy contracts. They would decide to relaunch under the Power of the Force branding and the same basic principle of Power of the Force 1, characters drawn from all three movies of the original trilogy. However, the first waves did focus on A New Hope. So, in July of 1995, Star Wars figures would again start arriving on toy shelves. Kenner Hasbro released the first figures with an orange laser stripe and Vader head on the card. There was a small profile picture of the character included, as well as a file card on the back of the card. This was there to help modern kids who maybe didn't own the movies on VHS or weren't watching the regular marathons on cable to learn about the characters. While some sources group the entire original 9 figures as Wave 1, and will sometimes lump in Boba Fett, Lando Calrissian, the TIE Fighter pilot, and X-Wing pilot Luke, for the first batch of Power of the Force 2, it's more accurate to group them into Year 1 and Year 2 for these first waves of figures. As all 9 did not necessarily ship in those original cases, there is strong anecdotal evidence that Lando, X-Wing Luke, the TIE pilot, and Boba Fett arrived in stores right before and after Christmas of 1995. But these were intended by Kenner to be 1996 releases and are therefore considered part of the Year 2 1996 line. I personally found X-Wing Luke, the TIE pilot, and Boba Fett right after Christmas of 1995, but before January 1st, 1996. In my area, the way the releases worked was Luke, Darth Vader, R2-D2, and the Stormtrooper were the first figures to hit the shelves in July of 1995, and then Han and Chewbacca followed in late summer, and finally Obi-Wan, C-3PO, and Princess Leia were in the fall. I've encountered anecdotal evidence of some markets getting all 9 figures in the summer of 1995, but this doesn't seem to be accurate for all markets, and seems to be really rare. Most places got them tiered out as I've outlined, with Leia being the very last figure to actually hit shelves in the late fall of 1995 and being severely short-packed. Early cardbacks and promotional photography in official publications, such as Star Wars Insider, did not include Princess Leia, and this left some wondering if Leia was going to be excluded. At the time, Kenner Hasbro toy lines were mostly excluding or minimizing women characters, so this was a reasonable thought. However, Leia did arrive in late fall, early winter. Princess Leia and C-3PO were originally short-packed, leading to them being difficult to locate, and early on they had a higher value on the secondary resale market. Both of them easily going for $35 to $50 on the secondary market. In 1995 money, with the inflation adjustment, that's $106.29 at the time of this recording. Today, you can still easily find Year 1 Power of the Force 2 Leia and C-3PO on orange cards and vintage toy stores, comic book shops, and online listings such as eBay for less than $10 US. By 1996, C-3PO would be easier to find in stores. However, Leia remained scarce and highly valued throughout most of 1996, with products not catching up with demand until early 1997, when stores were flooded with product in anticipation of the special editions. There have been rumors that the scarcity and late delayed release of the Leia figure was due to Carrie Fisher being unhappy with her likeness. But there is no actual evidence of this. No actors under George Lucas's tenure at Star Wars had likeness rights approval, with them signing this away as part of their contract when they signed on. Carrie Fisher very vocally joked about this in her one-woman show, Wishful Drinking, as well as in various appearances on talk shows throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Leia's later arrival on store shelves is mostly tied to Kenner Hasbro's reluctance to release women characters in this era, and short packing them due to the idea that women figures wouldn't sell, no matter how essential or core the character was. And this is especially true of Princess Leia Organa. Leia is very essential to Star Wars and Star Wars play patterns. Much like the vintage Kenner line, Power of the Force 2 would feature several mail-away figures. The first of these was Han Solo in Stormtrooper disguise. He was advertised starting in fall of 1995 on the back of Fruit Loops, a Kellogg's cereal. And while some of these Han Solo and Stormtrooper disguise figures did ship and arrive before the end of 1995, most of these were not received until early 1996. I'm going to go ahead and include him as part of 1995 because it appears Kenner's intent was that Stormtrooper Han would be a 1995 figure. So here we're going to go with the intention rather than the availability. It's also noteworthy that he's one of the first variants that had not appeared in the original vintage Kenner line. The original Power of the Force 2 figures were well received and incredibly popular, reigniting the fan base and basically starting the adult toy collecting phenomena as we know it today. However, there were some reservations around the extra buff sculpts and other conventions of 1990s action figures that Kenner designers adapted to Star Wars. There was quite a bit of critique, and in recent years, they've become a little bit of a joke to some collectors. Regardless, Kenner Hasbro sold a lot of these Star Wars toys in 1995, and they have not been out of the Star Wars action figure business in the 30 years since. While Power of the Force 2 would eventually course correct and help define the adult collector market, in these early days it still very much was a line for kids. The adult collector market was kind of unexpected, so they did course correct eventually, but it took a little bit of time. Toy lead times are about 1.5 to 2 years, and if you look at products starting in mid-1997 to 1998, you can see some adjustments happening based on the adult collector feedback. Kenner launched Power of the Force 2 with several vehicles. These were also tiered out, with the Millennium Falcon being one of the last Year 1 items released. All of these vehicles were reworkings of the vintage Kenner molds, with updated paint apps and stickers that were more accurate to the films, with other subtle but distinct changes to set them apart from the vintage toys. This did make the overly buff and posed Power of the Force 2 figures poor fits for the cockpits. As part of the first year of releases, Kenner also experimented with a few other lines beyond just the buff 3 3/4 figures. Among these were a 4-figure reissue of vintage figures, as well as repackaged reissued from the failed Action Masters diecast line. Now let's take a closer look at the original toys released in Power of the Force 2. Kenner Hasbro would release 9 individual figures starting in July of 1995. Luke Skywalker with grappling hook blaster and lightsaber. Luke was originally released with a long lightsaber. A running change would shift to a shorter lightsaber. In the early days of Power of the Force, the long saber could fetch more on the aftermarket, as could the transitional packaging, the long saber plastic tray with the shorter saber in it. Eventually, as supply caught up with demand, these sort of running changes wouldn't command much more money, as the 3 variants, long saber, short saber, and long saber tray and short saber, were produced pretty evenly, and fans snapped them up and kept them mint on card. You can still find these 3 variants fairly affordably on the aftermarket at the time of recording. This Luke would be released throughout 1995 and 1996. However, in 1997, when the packaging moved to the green laser bolt packaging, the original 1995 Farm Boy Luke would go out of production as a single carded figure. Variants of this version, as well as the original, remained readily available due to how deeply retailers ordered and stocked the early waves and the prolific purchases of the emerging scalper community. Darth Vader with lightsaber and removable cape. Darth Vader also had the lightsaber running change like Luke, and the short saber long tray and short saber and short tray variants are as common as the ones for Luke, despite the early fan frenzy and elevated prices. This version of Vader would be reproduced throughout the Power of the Force 2 line, not being discontinued until 1998 with the release of the removable helmet Vader from Return of the Jedi, with the next New Hope Vader released with a less buff build in the flashback wave prior to Episode 1. Stormtrooper with blaster rifle and heavy infantry cannon. The Stormtrooper would be released in every variation and packaging update through the final Comtech wave of Power of the Force 2. At this stage, he would finally be phased out of the line for a much better sculpted version of the Stormtrooper. However, during the Power of the Force 2 line, this basic sculpt would be used as the basis for every Stormtrooper variant. R2-D2 with light pipe, eye port, and retractable leg. R2-D2 would be re-released on the green card in 1997 and would appear in a Princess Leia Collection 2-pack. In 1998, a new version of R2-D2 would replace him, and after this, every year would see a new R2-D2 variant. The light pipe eye port feature was initially developed by Kenner in the 1980s, and there is some evidence that they plan to use it with the Jawa figures for later releases of the figure in the 1980s. However, the first time they used it in a toy was the Dark Side action figure from Kenner Superpowers. This is also the first version of R2-D2 to feature a retractable leg. While the 1979 Droid Factory playset included a retractable leg, it was a plug-in feature that fit into a standard R2-D2 figure and not part of the actual sculpt. Han Solo with heavy assault rifle and blaster. This Han Solo would be released in every form of packaging released in Power of the Force, and would be the basis for mini pack-in and deluxe figure variants until the final wave of Comtech figures finally introduced a new head sculpt and a far superior body sculpt for this version of Han Solo. The sculpt here is such that he was one of the hardest figures to stand up and pose. Chewbacca, with bowcaster and heavy blaster rifle. Chewbacca would be released in every form of packaging released in Power of the Force and would be the basis for the cinema scene variant in 1997. It would not be until 1998 that a new sculpt of him was introduced, with Chewbacca as Boush's bounty. A New Hope Chewbacca would be finally released in The Power of the Jedi, the line that followed Power of the Force. Ben, Obi-Wan Kenobi, with lightsaber and removable cloak. Ben Kenobi would be released on every form of packaging released in Power of the Force, and would be the basis for many pack-in and deluxe figure variants, until the flashback wave of figures before Episode 1 finally introduced a new variant. He also had the lightsaber running change like Luke and Darth Vader. The long saber, the short saber long tray, and short saber variants are as common for Ben Kenobi as the ones for Luke and Vader. Ben Kenobi can be difficult to stand without the removable cloak, and the removable cloak is basically just a chunk of plastic. However, the body sculpt beneath it is fairly nice, and isn't overtly muscular like some of the figures in this line are. C-3PO with realistic metallized body. C-3PO included no weapons, but he was VAC metal gold. He would be re-released on the green card in 1997. In 1998, this mold would be retired, and a new, more accurate sculpt for C-3PO was introduced. Princess Leia Organa with laser pistol and assault rifle. Princess Leia came with a plastic cape and plastic skirt, which were removable. And originally, the removable skirt belt had three very distinctive grooves on it, but there would only be one groove in later releases. Whether this was an actual running change or related to the Leia skirt molds losing some of the details over time as more figures were made has never been entirely clear. This Leia would be re-released on the green card in 1997. In 1998, this mold would be retired, and a new, far superior sculpt for A New Hope Leia was introduced. For more on this version of Princess Leia, see the playlist at the end of the video. I have a couple videos on the Power of the Force Princess Leia. Mail away Han Solo in Stormtrooper disguise with removable helmet. This was an exclusive mail-in figure via Kellogg's Cereals and was not originally available in any other form. A slightly modified version with a different arm and leg pose would be released in 1997 as part of a Toys R Us 3-pack. He does have sculpting differences from the single-carded Stormtrooper figure released as part of Year 1, so this is not even straight reuse of an existing figure. It would take many years for a single-carded retail release of this variant of Han Solo to reach store shelves. Luke Skywalker's Landspeeder. The Landspeeder is a reuse of the vintage vehicle mold. It is possible with a little elbow grease to get Obi-Wan and Luke in the front seat. The foot pegs on the back are oddly placed and do not really facilitate the droids tagging along as the pegs on the back of the seats did in the original Kenner release of 1978. It's possible that it's the age of my Landspeeder, but the wheels on here don't seem to drop all that low. They drop low enough to roll, but not as low as I seem to remember them doing back in 1995, and definitely not as low as the original 1978 Landspeeder did. Luke Skywalker's X-Wing fighter. Like all other Year 1 Power of the Force 2 vehicles, Luke's X-Wing is a reuse of the original 1978 mold. It has improved paint apps and stickers that are more realistic to the movie, but the toy is still not entirely film accurate, as it has the original concessions made by Kenner to the on-screen design to make it more toyetic. It does have electronic sounds, and if you push in the R2-D2 dome, which is a button, the wings do still pop open. It's a fairly sturdy toy designed for kids. The more buff figure style of Power of the Force 2 makes Luke a tough fit in the cockpit, but with a little finagling, he will in fact fit inside, and you can even close the transparent cockpit cover. My Power of the Force 2 X-Wing was unopened, so for the video I opened it and applied the labels. I really hate putting stickers on. Imperial TIE Fighter. The TIE Fighter is also a reuse of the original 1978 mold. This time Kenner used a bluish-gray plastic that is closer to being screen accurate. The original on-screen model was more of a blue-gray color, but due to the special effects and how the blue screens used to create the space scenes affected that, the TIE fighters in the movie appear far more light gray on screen for the original 1977 movie. Both the Stormtrooper and Darth Vader, minus his cape, fit in the cockpit with the doors easily closing over them. The toy also retains the original 1978 action feature, press a button and the wings pop off. It does not retain any electric or light components of the original, with the battery panel from the original toy now being a molded unopening piece. The Imperial ATST Walker, aka the Chicken Walker. This is another reuse. Oddly, the ATST driver figure was not released until spring of 1997 as part of a Return of the Jedi focused wave. You should be able to push the button on the back of the walker and it should simulate walking, but mine doesn't work, and frankly it's never worked. Not even brand new out of the box back in 1995. It's possible this is limited to mine and everyone else's work. Sometimes it's the luck of the draw with toys. And back in 1995, I didn't take it back because this was one of the harder to find items in Power of the Force 2. It dropped in late 1995 and appeared sporadically in my area through mid 1996. It was not reissued in green packaging and would not be revisited in the Power of the Force 2 era. However, none of that detracts from the nice mold and solid paint apps. Figures fit easily inside even with the lid closed. In this respect, this is the most successful of the mold reuses for Power of the Force 2, as the figures fit here the best. The Top Gun on mine was long ago lost, so I picked up a reproduction from eBay to replace it, and I went ahead and installed it while filming this footage because, hey, it was out, why not? The reuse of the original 1978 molds for the Millennium Falcon is most notable and probably the poorest choice of these original vehicles. While the new paint deco and choice of plastic color are nice, the reuse of the mold means that the figures are a poor fit. It's difficult to fit the figures around the game board, and the figures have to be jammed into the gunner station to turn it around without the figure's head getting caught, and Chewbacca just won't fit. You can fit a few figures into the hidden compartment, but no more than 3, and that's only if Chewbacca and Obi-Wan in his robe aren't one. If you take the robe off of Obi-Wan, then he'll fit with 2 other figures. Chewbacca, it's just going to be Chewbacca and 1 other figure to fit comfortably. Chewbacca can even comfortably fit into the cockpit based on the sculpting on his legs. While Han will fit, it does take a little bit of effort. Also, the vintage toy included an arm with a string that had a small plastic bead on it that was intended to represent the training ball Luke practices with on the Millennium Falcon. This version did not include that. The stickers are an improvement over the original 1978 toy, although I found it way more annoying to apply them 30 years later, and slightly stressful. The vintage toy contained electronic components, and so does the 1995 one. The Power of the Force 2 version includes 4 real movie sounds and electronic lights. Overall, this is a nice piece. It displays quite nicely, and while it doesn't work particularly well with the Power of the Force figures from 1995, later, when Kenner Hasbro began to resculpt figures more accurately to their on-screen appearances, those work much better with it. As part of the first year releases, Kenner experimented with other scales and lines other than just the buff 3 3/4 figures. Among these were reissues of vintage figures, as well as reissues from their failed Action Masters die-cast line. The classic 4-pack was a re-release of figures that were recast from the vintage Kenner original 12 3 3/4 figures: Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, Han Solo, and Chewbacca. It was the original small head version of Han, which was one of the running production changes in the original Kenner line. This set also included 4 Topps wide vision cards specific to each of the characters. This was a Toys R Us exclusive. Initially, this peg-warmed before it went away, and later it became one of the few items in the Power of the Force 2 range to retain some of the higher collector's value original Power of the Force 2 items had. Currently on eBay before shipping, these tend to range from $35 to $100 for the entire set, depending on the state of the box. Some of the ones in the higher range on eBay right now seem to be a little unrealistic based on the boxes being beat to hell, but you do you, eBay seller. There were also die-cast metal collectibles released in 2 sets. These were just repackaged Action Masters die-cast items from the previous Hasbro Kenner line. The 2 multi-pack sets were both released with Power of the Force 2 branding. These figures were posed in a similar style to the vintage micro collection through Kenner, and just as much fun, but these were a quick way to get Power of the Force 2 product on shelves, as the initial frenzy in 1995 for Star Wars toys vaguely echoed some of the original fervor for 1977 and 1978. These were larger than the original micro collection, but this was possibly a way to keep them from treading on the license held by competitor Galoob for Micro Machines, which did include that smallest scale that the original micro collection had been in. The first item we'll look at is a 6-pack. It's a window box item with 6 exclusive trading cards. Figures included were Bespin Luke, Stormtrooper, Boba Fett, Darth Vader, Han Solo, and Chewbacca. The 4-pack was a blister card with 4 exclusive trading cards. The figures included were Obi-Wan, Ben Kenobi, C-3PO, R2-D2, and Princess Leia. Leia is posed hunching over so she can insert the stolen data disk into R2-D2. These pre-poses, especially the one for Leia, aren't particularly fun, and lend themselves more to being collectibles than to actual toys that kids might play with. It's very easy to look at all of these overly posed figures with their 1990s sculpting and roll your eyes and make fun of them. However, it's worth noting that this was in fact the norm, and part of what moved action figures away from that overly posed action sculpting of the 1990s was Power of the Force 2. The influx of adult collectors that Power of the Force created and drew into toy aisles moved the line and action figures as a whole toward the current standard of realism or sculpts that are more true to the animation or art that they're based on. Personally, I've always had a fondness for Power of the Force 2, as they're the main reason I'm here today on the internet talking about and sharing my love of the toys I collect. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit the like. If you'd like to see more of this, you should subscribe. I regularly do toy history videos with the focus on Star Wars, vintage Kenner, as well as 80s properties like Masters of the Universe, Princes of Power, and many more.